Thank you for joining us this afternoon. It's been a packed day of terrific panels and speeches. I expect we'll have a few more folks joining us over the next 45 minutes, but I'm thrilled that we're having this conversation and we have some true experts top of field to discuss an issue that we're really interested in at FREOPP. If you happen to join the session where Ovik was interviewing Aparna, you heard a little preview of what we're interested in here, and that is addressing two big challenges facing American governance. First, ensuring that people, particularly those living on the bottom half of the socioeconomic ladder, have access to the federal benefits that they need and that can help them and take care of their families and in many cases lift them out of poverty. On the other side of that coin, we're really interested and concerned about the long-term fiscal challenges facing the nation, and realizing that in the coming years and particularly in the coming decades that federal policymakers are going to have to face very difficult decisions about prioritization. And in the short run, addressing some of the significant losses that the United States government experiences every year to fraud and to program integrity and to improper payments. The numbers are staggering. GAO, which is the trusted authority of watchdogs working for Congress, estimates that the United States government has been losing between $230 billion to $520 billion annually to fraud over the past 4 years. Those are big numbers. The improper payment rate, though it is not the best and most precise estimate for misspending across federal agencies, is in the ballpark of $230 billion, though that's a lower bound, knowing that many really challenged programs do not even provide estimates. At FREOPP, we've been developing over the past year what we think may be a novel approach to solving both of these questions, which Ovik mentioned earlier, is to look to other nations that have developed a federal digital identity, notably Estonia, as a means for streamlining access to government benefits, while also ensuring that those benefits go to the people who are eligible for them. We put out a paper that you can see on the FREOPP website last month, and we've been socializing this idea with folks in informal settings, and are open to feedback. And I will present to you some of the challenges that we've immediately heard, even internally, as we discussed this topic. How will the American people receive any sort of digital ID when they're increasingly skeptical of the federal government? Mm-hmm. We had the experience of the 20-year rollout of ongoing rollout of the Federal Real ID Act following the September 11 terrorist attacks and the intelligence reforms that happened back in the early 2000s. Issues of rural communities having less access to technology, very thorny questions of who will be eligible for federal benefits if there's a federal digital ID established. And there's an immigration discussion going on right now. What does that mean for the many millions of people living here without documentation? Those are just a few of the thorny questions that we've encountered. But today, I'm thrilled to have two of the leading experts in the field talk with us about this issue, the related issues of accessing federal programs, the time tax that Aparna mentioned earlier, and also the challenges with program integrity. Linda they told me under strict rules I can't give your bios here. I point you to the handbooks they handed out, but Linda's one of the top experts from the federal government looking at waste and fraud, and was heavily involved in the Pandemic Recovery Accountability Center, the PRAC, is that the right acronym? But never has so much been spent so quickly with so few guardrails and needing so much oversight. So we can learn from that. With that backdrop, I would offer up some opening remarks. Take it where you wish.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. And thank you all for being here. So I think, what I love I think, Dan, about your paper is it fits very neatly into the issues that I was talking about earlier. So I've done a lot of research on the safety net, program access, what are the challenges that people face in sort of accessing programs that they are benefit programs that they're eligible for. There's a really interesting study. Aside from the research that I've done, I was digging into other research from the Urban Institute that finds that if people were actually accessing all the benefits that they are entitled to, we would be spending about $200 billion more, right, than what we are currently spending. So clearly there's a challenge there. I think where where your material fits in with mine is, there's a sense that the access issues are maybe primarily a result of fraud, right? Like Avik mentioned that there are, counties in the South where there's a sense that all of this is because, people are taking up benefit programs that they are not working hard for, they're not eligible for, and so there's a ton of fraud. I think where we could do better with the digital ID is we can help people understand what they're actually eligible for, right? So to my understanding, I don't know if there's a great distinction, honestly, between what is fraud and what is just, people don't understand the programs that they're eligible for. What are they qualifying for? Do I meet the EITC criteria because my child stayed with me for, 5 months and 30 days, but, spent less time somewhere else? But I think with the digital ID, you could probably, help to sort of resolve some of those challenges. I don't know if it goes far enough, with doing that, but I think it could help with the integrity of program design, make sure that some of the onus on, benefit receipt is on the government. What's always striking to me is during the pandemic, how much simpler the system for benefit receipt actually became, right? Like we felt like there was a need to send cash out quickly and immediately to people, which happened through stimulus payments or cash payments. The CTC became, we were handing out cash every month through the child tax credit. We just made it a much simpler system. And then we kind of applauded ourselves and said, look, wow, poverty went down. And that's kind of what got me thinking about, well, what happens in other times, right? Is the onus on the taxpayer then to apply constantly for things that they think they're eligible for, to figure out what they are, qualify for, and so on. So I think, there's a huge amount of overlap between, okay, how much of this is fraud and can we use a digital ID to actually address that? And how much of this is confusion about programs and helping people understand that, yes, you are actually eligible for this and you should be getting this benefit. I don't know if that gets at, what you were asking about.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be the one to say that there's a lot of fraud, that a lot of it is fraud. The $200 billion in unclaimed, let's call it, benefits, people who are entitled to benefits they don't get, notwithstanding. There's one kind of problem and then there's another kind of problem. And the other kind of problem is misunderstood and undercounted. It's an afterthought to most federal leaders, state and local government as well. During the pandemic, I was the executive director of the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee for a year. There was a lot of fraud during the pandemic. And that fraud wasn't just, your run-of-the-mill, sort of petty criminal who's trying to get a PPP loan and buy a Lamborghini. That happened too. But we also saw coordinated nation-state actors working together to steal at scale. We saw rings operating that were stealing in all 50 states of the unemployment insurance program. In California, there was one enterprising ring that stole pandemic unemployment benefits on behalf of every prisoner in the California penal system because they didn't have the data to match against incarcerated individuals in the state of California. So somebody knew that and they went ahead and applied on behalf of every prisoner and got the money. And then they were gone, right? So you can't get that money back. And so did we have a serious problem with fraud? We absolutely did during the pandemic, and we still do. Every time there's a hurricane or a natural disaster, the same fraud actors are stealing people's identities and applying for benefits, and they're doing it on the scale of, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of applications a day. And so it's a little known problem because agencies frequently do not like to talk about this. It makes them look bad. And so they say we don't really have fraud. And because fraud is deceptive, you don't know how much fraud you have. It's pretty easy to say we don't have a lot of fraud. And then everyone's like, believes you, because there's not a lot of evidence to refute that. And so it's this sort of very silent problem in the government. And so I started the Program Integrity Alliance this summer in order to start to look for ways that private sector and government could work together, because government isn't really, I spent 10 years at GAO, we were telling agencies that they should worry about fraud, and they were saying, oh, go talk to the IG. That's not our responsibility. Our responsibility is get the benefits out the door. And if somebody wants to worry about fraud, that's what the Inspector General is for. Obviously, the Inspector General can only come in later and come back and get the money when it's been spent. They cannot prevent. They're statutorily barred from being able to being involved with preventing fraud. And so if you've got agency people in charge of these programs who are saying fraud is not our job, and you've got the IG saying, well, preventing fraud is not our job, then that means nobody's job is preventing fraud. And this should concern anyone who's a taxpayer.
On that point, improper payments has been a area of federal concern. I used to work for the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, and it felt like every year there was a hearing around improper payments, and every few years there was a bill. And this is the GAO has been estimating improper payments rates since 2003, and this is really like a slow-moving iceberg that's kind of we're constantly bumping into. But it's largely the approach to date has been on the backside. It's a lot about estimating the problem and trying to claw back or chase in some cases. But even when it comes to estimating, are we getting at the scope of the problem? Or you had a piece over the weekend looking at kind of some recommendations that you'd have for the new administration to get at fraud. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. So I've testified before a variety of committees over the last year and a half, and I did write a piece on this new DOGE Department of Government Efficiency that has become a priority now with the incoming administration, and what they can do to focus on improving efficiency. And we know that this problem's existed for a long, long time. Improper payments legislation began in 2002. So agencies have been required to report on their improper payment rates for over 20 years, and the numbers have risen. Now, that's not always bad, because sometimes looking for it is good. You find it when you look for it. But the reality is most agencies haven't done a good job either of estimating, and GAO says that every year, that they don't do a good job of estimating how much of their improper payment rate really is. And then they do very little to identify the root cause. When I testified about a month ago before the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, I did a small analysis of the payment.accuracy.gov, which is the website that agencies report on the high priority programs. So there's about 30 of those programs. And they report on their root causes for improper payments. Now, if you go and look at those scorecards closely, every quarter they're more or less, they are in fact reporting the same root cause every quarter. They're not seeing a reduction. In most cases, they're seeing an increase, but they're reporting the same root cause. And apparently nobody seems to care. Everyone thinks that's perfectly fine, that your job is just to report the root cause and then talk about how you're not doing anything about it and just come back next quarter and tell us the same thing. But if you look at that, the root cause in like 85% of improper payment, high priority programs is failure to verify information, or failure to get the information and basically relying on self-reported information. So primarily we have an improper payments and fraud problem in the government because we take people at their word. We say, oh, okay, you say you make this much money, well, you get this benefit. Oh, you say you live here, you get this. I mean, during the pandemic, we saw people applying for unemployment insurance, and they said they lived in the state of Virginia, but then the bank account was a credit union in California, and everyone was like, that's fine, that looks good. we shouldn't, I mean, that credit union doesn't even exist in Virginia. How are you going to make a payment to a credit union based on the other side of the country? Because you're not checking it. You're just like, there we go. There's where we'll send the money. And so we know that the problem is a data problem. And that's why when I talk about this, and the reason we created the Program Integrity Alliance is because it's a data problem that has to be solved with data. It has to be solved with technology. We have to put in place tools for agencies to verify the information before they make the payment. But in order to do that, we need those leaders to care and to recognize that, number one, there's a problem, and number two, there's a solution to the problem, and then implement the solutions to the problems, which, by the way, has a lot to do with data privacy, data access, data transparency, data reliability, all the really challenging issues we talk about in these kinds of forums all the time that are not easy to answer. So I'm not suggesting this is an easy problem to solve, but there are solutions.
I can add to that, Dan. One of the research areas that I started looking into was the Paycheck Protection Program during the pandemic. Again, this was a new program for small businesses that came out during the pandemic because, we were worried that in the next 6 months, who knows how many small businesses would simply collapse and die as a result of the pandemic, and consumers not coming out and, buying stuff from them, or restaurants shutting down. And so the PPP, the way it was designed was, like you're saying, self-reported. Am I worried that in the next 6 months, my revenues would go down by more than 25%? Well, if you self-reported that you thought revenues would go down by more than 25%, you were eligible for a PPP. And initially they called it a loan, but at such a low rate that essentially people assumed it was a grant. And the only condition was that you would continue to employ the same number of people. And again, there was confusion there because, it wasn't clear whether you had to employ the same person, throughout the pandemic, or you could, some businesses could just let go of some people, but then rehire other people by the time they, asked for the loan forgiveness. And so I started interviewing some small business owners after they had gotten their loans or grants, forgiven. And I said, well, what was the process by which the government kind of said, you're getting 100% loan forgiveness? And I said, again, it was all self-reported. So you could basically go into the system and you could say that, I kept all these people. I had 30 people before, I have 30 people now. And, and you got 100% of your loan forgiven. And in fact, if you look at the data now from the Small Business Administration, I think 99% of loans have been forgiven, like 100% forgiven. And, so you just worry because a lot of these businesses clearly, like, I'm not saying it's outright fraud, but the conditions, they were so lax, right? The rules around self-reporting, the rules around what was expected, how much of your money should have gone into worker compensation as opposed to, paying rent or something else. Like, those rules kept changing throughout the course of, the recovery. And so now you have a situation where you've basically, given huge grants to small businesses, and it wasn't clear that, those were warranted to begin with. So I agree with Linda, there are true cases of absolutely abuse and, fraud in the system.
We're having this conference at a unique time of a presidential transition. Do either of you have views on what lessons could be learned from the Biden administration? There've been done some efforts to try and address the time tax and to make programs more accessible. There's also an ongoing program integrity effort. Any thoughts on what can we take away from the past 4 years? What's gone right? What's gone wrong?
Yeah, well, I will say that certainly in the SBA loan programs, I mean, PPP was a forgivable loan program. So it was a grant. I mean, everybody knew that your loan was going to be forgiven. When the Biden administration came in, they did, to their credit, begin implementing more controls around the restaurant revitalization program and the SVOG, the shuttered venues operations grants. So they started requiring more information to verify the information that those entities that were applying for those grants and loans, to make sure they were who they said they were. So they got a lot better. They learned a lot from the first and second rounds of PPP. I think the Biden administration paid some lip service early on to the importance of fraud. They put out an executive order they focused that executive order very much on law enforcement and inspector general community. And I think that was disappointing to some of us who understood that the need was really on the management side in the prevention space. And there wasn't as much of a push from the White House as maybe I would have hoped to try to really get agencies to focus on that. I will say that there have been some pockets of really some lessons that we've learned. So I think the best one, frankly, is in the fall last year, the IRS identified data that indicated that it looked like the employee retention tax credit it looked like a lot of people were defrauding that program. And number one, they used data to identify a potential problem, a pattern. And then they announced they were not going to make any more payments and they were going to go look at all of these, and which was crazy. I mean, that's like, to get agreement from the administration and OMB and everybody, we're going to put a pause on this program while we go look at this. And they found that 70% of those applications were fraudulent and they didn't make those payments. And that's exactly what we want agencies to do. We want you to use data, look for a pattern that says, wow, it looks like we've got, large scale fraud happening here. Because these fraud actors today are sophisticated. And so when they're doing this, they're not doing it here and there. They're doing it in like large pockets and you can find this in the data. And then stopping it before you make a payment. And so that's an example of something I would love to see the new administration really double down on, is incentivizing leaders to take the time to wait before they make a payment. And yes, there will be an impact probably on those people who are legitimate beneficiaries. That is unfortunately the reality. You can't, however, I will say that banks and insurance companies and other private sector entities we all engage with regularly, they know how to use what we call frictionless or friction-free authentication and validation techniques, so that we know when we're signing up for a bank account or when we're getting a new insurance product, it's pretty easy and seamless and fast to get approved if we are who we say we are. But they're also putting in place anti-fraud tools that are very easily and quickly identifying when it's a fraud actor or a synthetic identity or a stolen identity that's applying for that benefit or that is opening that account or making a change to their account. And so the government, those tools are available, but they do require investment. And most, again, getting back to the incentive problem, the agencies aren't incentivized to look for fraud. And so then they're not incentivized to spend money investing in tools that would help you find the fraud before you make the payment the way the private sector does. And so it has to be fixed through incentives. It has to be fixed through investment in technology. And it has to be, I think it really has, there has to be a recognition that it needs to take a risk-based approach. There's like 20, 30 programs that are really high risk. That's where we should be focusing the attention, and it should be data-driven and outcome-oriented. We should be using an evidence-based approach to this.
So I'm going to talk about program benefit access rather than, I think Linda is covering the fraud piece, amazingly well. So what struck me during the pandemic or the last 4 years, of the recovery was how we improved ease of access to benefit programs during the pandemic, right? The first thing we did was, I remember being in the White House and there was suddenly a lot of discussion around, we need to send cash out, right? Because cash is the biggest help to people on the ground. And if you try to just expand the safety net, which is through SNAP or even the EITC and other programs, that's going to take a while to sink in, right? Like those programs take a while. People will have to apply, etc. And so really the best way to help people on the ground is through cash payments. And so we immediately started sending out cash to people. The second thing was, unemployment compensation was increased significantly. So, and that's part of what fed into, I guess, people overclaiming UI, the pandemic UI program. Suddenly people were getting, like the average used to be, I think, $250 a week. The traditional UI safety net was about $250 a week. That suddenly went up to like $800 a week. So there was like a $600 a supplement to the UI benefit. And again, that was another way by which we just expanded cash, to low-income households. And then the third were programs like the Paycheck Protection Program, right? Like small businesses could keep people on, help pay for their salaries and wages, even though there was probably not a lot of business coming in. So I think finally the child tax credit expansions and making the CTC monthly and making sure that we were sending, cash to people in advance, sending them monthly payments. We removed the sort of the earned income requirement, like no one had to show eligibility for the CTC. So a lot of those, a lot of what we did during the pandemic was really make it so easy for people to feel like, yes, the government is reaching out to me, as opposed to the system that exists in normal times, which is I have to go and apply for what I'm eligible for, right? And so that to me was the biggest takeaway. It wasn't like, did the cash supplements work, or did the CTC expansions work, or is it the specific programs? It's really like the mentality or the perspective of how are we going to get support out. That was the key, and that was all the discussion we heard. So I was at CEA at that time. That was all we heard. How do we get the people the help they need, right? When you go back to more normal times, that is not the mentality at all, right? The mentality is, we're gonna, if you want to apply for this, here's the office you have to go to, here's the paperwork you need to fill out, here's, you figure out the eligibility and so on. So I think for me, the lesson was, the happy mix is somewhere in the middle, right? Like, we shouldn't make it so hard for people to access programs if we really think that, and maybe a lesson is, yes, cash supports need to be broadened, right? Because they are the one thing that people immediately need when there's a crisis, right? So what I was talking about earlier is my proposal for, you could give people temporary cash support. So I don't think, like Avik was asking about universal basic income, right? And that comes up all the time. Should we have UBI? I don't think we will ever get political alignment on UBI, right? We shouldn't be paying people, I don't know, even $3,000 a month endlessly or forever, because we've all aligned on UBI. I don't think those systems are sustainable fiscally, and I don't think people would react. I think there would be work incentive problems if we just guaranteed people a minimum sort of wage benefit. But you could have temporary programs that are kind of like, okay, it's a temporary basic income cash transfer for 2 months. We are going to give you, we're not going to hold you to a standard where you have to apply for a program, get meet a work requirement, do X, Y, and Z in order to even get the basic help from the government. I think we can give you cash, hopefully potentially audit that, yes, you did report that you had that crisis, but then give people that 2 months window to then apply for the regular safety net, right? And so I think that there are compromises and solutions in the middle, which, if we understand that cash helps, then let's dig into that. Let's figure out what we can be doing better on that.
Just to add to that, I'll throw out the question to you both, and then I'll take my pitch at answering it. Imagine Elon Musk comes into the room for a few moments. He's asking for advice for the new Department of Government Efficiency, the DOGE, so to speak. It's a lot of questions about how that will work and where it will live and what they will do. But we've seen a lot of interest even on X over the past day or so, looking at outdated technology systems. They're surprised that the government is still running on old computers. There's a lot of interest in these fraud estimates and improper payments. Our attempt to answer this, as Ovik alluded to earlier, was to try and establish a pre-check equivalent for accessing government benefits that are more secure than the Social Security card, some form of digital ID that people would have the ability to access, like they do right now with login.gov, by going to a post office and verifying themselves, or doing a remote verification. But to ensure, if we set up any sort of payment regime, on a voluntary basis, have people opt into a way to both prove who they are and authenticate they are who they say they are at any given time. That I think would be Ovik and my pitch. If Mr. Musk and Mr. Ramaswamy were to walk in the room, what would you ladies pitch?
Yeah, I did pitch this in an op-ed recently. So as GAO estimated that there was about $521 billion annually lost to fraud. I think that number is quite low. That was really only a federal estimate. They didn't even include states in that. So, and we know that states are losing a lot of money to fraud. So I think that starting there is a nice place to go, right? So when you're looking for efficiency, fraud, waste, abuse, these things, we know that they're a problem. We also know that technology can solve this problem. And we know that the private sector has employed successfully a lot of the technologies that can address them. However, I also know that a lot of agencies are not set up. And a lot of the reason why we saw the pandemic fraud that we saw, I testified early on during the pandemic, and there was a member of a state UI program there, and he was just talking about how, they didn't have the ability to find the fraud in those programs. And given the technology, the outdated technology, the COBOL, the fact that, these are very many legacy systems, there's also really serious problems with data sharing and data access. So for instance, we're really proud of ourselves because after 10 years, now the Department of Treasury's Do Not Pay program has access to the death file. I mean, actually, they don't even have it fully. They just wrote a law giving Do Not Pay access to the Social Security death file, like not even a whole year ago. It's not even been implemented. This blows my mind, but we're like, wow, isn't that great? Now we can check to see if dead people are dead before we make a payment. We're using a federal data validation system that can't even access data that is another government agency has. But now we've got the death data, so great. And so, these sophisticated fraud actors are stealing at scale. They're on the dark webs. They've got access to every American's identity information. They can make synthetic identities. They can do all kinds of really sophisticated things using generative AI and deepfake technology. And we are just happy that we can tell you if, by the way, that data is known not to be very good. GAO has written reports that the death data is incomplete. But that's the first time Treasury's even gotten access to that data. So the cultural and the technological, the policy and the legal barriers to sharing data is something that the new administration, if they really want to start to address this problem, they have to start helping agencies get access to the data. And they have to make it easier. We have a privacy, and one of the things that the Program Integrity Alliance that I just started, one of our first initiatives is we're doing some research with NAPA on the policy tensions between data access and data use for privacy and access, right? So we're very concerned about privacy. Understandably, Americans should be concerned about privacy, but fraud actors have your data. And so, but we don't want the government to have the data to help prevent the fraud. But that's obviously, it's a perverse incentive. At this point, privacy is kind of not something that really anybody has anymore, whether you want to or not. And so by not allowing the government to access the important data that they need to be able to identify whether you are who you say you are. And I do think a digital identity has promise as a concept. I do believe, though, that as much time as I've spent in this field looking at the fight that privacy advocates and people who want to increase access to data have been having for the last 20, 30 years. I mean, the Evidence-Based Policymaking Commission, my friend Robert Shea was on that, and he talked about how they had to get these privacy zealots, really to the table and trying to get some common ground with them, even to get past that law. And so a digital identity, I fear, is destined for an enormous amount of fighting around privacy. And so we're trying to contribute, the Program Integrity Alliance is trying to contribute to that conversation by doing that research and looking at the policy tensions between privacy and access. But I think whatever we do, whether we can get so far as a digital identity, which is, I think, a very high level goal, or we can just get agencies better access to data, and we can get them the investment in the tools and technologies that they're going to need to be able to use that data. There is a lot of low-hanging fruit out there that this DOGE can avail itself of if they're really interested in doing some things. But you're going to have to start thinking outside the box. You're going to have to stop doing this reporting requirement stuff that improper payments regime has created. And you're going to have to start using data and outcomes and really looking at what's working, doing pilot programs and identifying, oh, this worked, this didn't work, let's try this again, and let's try this doing this, and let's use this data set, not that data set. It's going to be an iterative process, but I do think it has to be a data-driven and outcome-oriented, evidence-based approach, no matter what we do.
Yeah, I'm completely aligned with the technology piece. I feel like that's where the biggest, innovation can happen, which could address a lot of what we're talking about here. I'm going back to the example, like I think in your paper, Dan, you talk about the Aadhaar card in India, right? And the reason it's such an innovation is you can imagine the millions of people who are living in rural areas who don't even have like a birth certificate, are now have access to an Aadhaar card that's basically giving them legitimacy, right? Yes, now I can go and access benefits. Now I can talk to the government. Now I can create a bank account. Now I have, it's legalizing, a lot of that population. I think where I see and where I completely agree with Linda is, when I look at program access and benefits access, one of the biggest challenges is the lack of information sharing across departments, right? Like if someone's telling me this is my income and assets, why is it that that same information cannot be shared across different government agencies? Why is that not something the IRS can share with, different government agencies so that then we can decide on, what are people eligible for? I feel like there's so much administrative, churn just around figuring out, that one program and then yet another program, right? So I think there's a big role to play, like if that office does actually become a thing, in just figuring out how technology can simplify and improve access to programs. There's a lot to be done.
We have about 10 minutes left. I wanted to turn to the audience and ask if there are any questions. We'd love to get your input. Yes. If you don't mind introducing yourself.
Hi, Rachel Gressler with the Heritage Foundation. I guess I have a question for each of you. And first, Linda, on the payment integrity side, we know that there are laws on the books that agencies should be doing more of the right thing, but they're not. And when incentives aren't enough, is there any room for the new administration to put actual consequences, like add some teeth to this? Would some of that have to come from Congress? I know a lot of it is mandatory spending, so you can't just cut tax credits and things like that. And for you, Aparna, just in the creation of like making it easier to get these benefits, I'm just thinking through like the complexity of the layers of some of them being run at the federal level and some at the state level. At what point does it become so burdensome that the people that you really want to help are the ones that aren't able to navigate that and figure it out? And then you end up kind of getting only those who are able to figure out the system, who would also tend to be people, the fraud actors are great at figuring out the system.
Yeah, I would start with the incentives. I mean, I've been asked this question a lot by some congressional staffers who are looking to put, some sticks into their legislation in addition to carrots. And of course, it's not, if you cut someone's budget, all you're doing is cutting. That doesn't work, right? Because the money's going out the door, their benefits. So it's, you're not gonna, you lose their staff, there's even less they can do, right? And so that isn't gonna work. But what I've spent some time thinking about is what does motivate leaders in government. And what motivates leaders in government is what they really hate. And I know this because I both worked at GAO, where I was that person, and now I work as a consultant helping them deal with those people, which is oversight. They hate oversight. There's nothing they want less than GAO or the IG coming in and telling them, there's something they have to do. They have to take that seriously. They have to implement those recommendations somehow, even if it's kind of, half-assed. And so, pardon my French. So, one thing I've thought about is in the private sector, we have monitorships, right? Like Wells Fargo, has, if they've found for a big fraud event, then somebody's come in and do a monitor. So it's like basically just be all over them. And so I've proposed the idea that you could have some of these big programs where you're not seeing reductions in the fraud or the improper payment rate over, many years, bringing them in for annual hearings, having those leaders respond to why is that not going down? And then having like significant oversight. Like you're going to have quarterly reviews by GAO and the IG on these issues. We're going to be holding you accountable for taking action. We're going to be watching what you're doing. We're not going to be accepting it. If you go and look at, after we passed the Fraud Reduction Data Analytics Act of 2019, I went and did analysis that first year it was implemented, like how are agencies implementing this law? And they had to report in their AFR, their annual financial report. And I'm not even exaggerating when I tell you that like 75% of them, they had a sentence that said something like, we believe fraud risk management is very important. And that was their nod to, we implemented the fraud risk management framework. We said fraud's important, stopping fraud is important. And no one cared. They were like, cool. It's just like the report cards with the payment integrity. So there has to be something where you're not just allowing them to put a sentence in a report in order to say they did something. And that's going to require a lot more oversight. Now, GAO and IG don't have people to go in and do that. So we have to get more creative about how we're going to do that oversight. But I do think that that holding agencies more accountable, I also believe that should be built into their performance metrics. Right now, performance metrics in the government are about getting benefits out. There's no integrity performance metric. No one is held to, did you get that benefit to the right person? And so putting in place some performance metrics for leaders that incentivize integrity, that shows that this is one of the things you're going to be graded on and rated on. And then, to the extent that political appointees whose jobs are much more fluid, shall we say, those ones, you have some more flexibility to say, no, we're really expecting you to do this. And if you don't do this, we're going to replace you with somebody who is going to focus on this. But it has to come from the top. There has to be a tone at the top. I also really believe there should be a fraud czar. I mean, there's a border czar, so I just think there needs to be someone whose job it is to worry about fraud across the government and that has a really senior, seat at the table. And this is once you start having those kinds of things, then agency leaders are like, oh, you guys care. Guess I should do this. Because if they don't hear that you care, they won't do it.
So my idea, Rachel, is simply that this just cannot be on the taxpayer to claim, right? The idea is if we are integrating across all different government agencies and integrating at the federal and state level, and we're putting in place enough guardrails and technology to really make sure that the benefit, amounts or whatever that we're calculating are in fact accurate, then I think the onus is on the government to say, okay, now we have your income and asset information. Here's what you're eligible for. So I do think you just need to change how we think about things, right? Code for America is like a nonprofit that just got a huge grant, for a few states, and they're trying to do this. Like there's this one-stop shop or one web page where people can go and say, okay, they provide their information at one time, and then what they're doing in the background is creating that integrated benefit system where now you're actually applying for 7 different programs at the same time. They are facing a lot of, I have had a discussion with them. They're like, we can change the technology, but there's still a lot of sort of actual background work and getting agencies to talk to each other, right? So that they cannot fix. They can't come in from the outside and ensure that politically that's a solution that happens. But I think that's where we need to be, right? Like for the taxpayer or the benefit recipient, it's like one page or one intake, web page. And then there's a lot of work that happens in the background that's not the responsibility of the taxpayer to figure out, right? It should be able to happen.
But you probably would need at least like birth certificates.
You would need documentation once, yes.
Have to come in the home and see that the child is living there type of thing.
Yeah, and I was trying to think through that because I'm wondering like if they can put in childcare expenses, right? Like if I'm giving you a monthly, like what you would do to claim the child independent care credit, right? I'm giving you a monthly receipt for childcare expenses. Can I use that to then make some determination of who is, which parent actually qualifies for that qualifying child? So I feel like the documentation exists. We just haven't thought through how to connect the pieces on how does the IRS then determine, how to provide benefits in the right way.
Any other questions from our audience? If not, I will take moderator prerogative to try and offer a closing question that I'll again try and answer myself. Any quick recommendation for Congress moving into a new 119th? Anything you'd like to see happen in the short term? And I'll throw out one issue I think should be on the radar is thinking about how CBO scores these issues. It's anybody who's heard some of the conversations earlier with the tax panel, a lot of how these programs will be evaluated over the next year, particularly in the tax policy, is going to end up in the CBO scorekeepers. And it's worth knowing that program integrity measures aren't scored in any way dynamic. So you're building up money to spend on program integrity is viewed simply as a cost, and there's no estimated savings. But that's my quick pitch for Congress. How about
just reduce complexity? That's it.
Yeah, I agree with the CBO scoring. I mean, we need to think about the fact that a return on investment is a big return. You know, there's one of the president budget gave additional ceiling for the Social Security Administration for continuing disability reviews. They calculated a 9-to-1 return on investment. So we know that you will save a lot more money if you invest in certain things, but the CBO does not count things that way. They count it as simply what does it cost, and if it costs, then it's detracted, not what might you save. And so I do think that we need to change how CBO scores. And I also think that GAO and the Department of Treasury have many recommendations. One really easy one is allow the Treasury to bring data sources into Do Not Pay without having to wait for OMB authorization. It takes like 18 months to 24 months to get a single data set into Do Not Pay. Sometimes it takes an act of Congress. It took GAO 10 years to get access to the National New Hire Database. We need the Treasury Department's Do Not Pay program to have access to data, and there are legislative proposals out there offering up those solutions. Yeah, that's a great question. Why does it take so long? Partly OMB is tiny, and that particular office has like 3 people working in it. And there's this really, really bureaucratic and arcane process for checking to see if this data set should be something Treasury, whereas Treasury knows. They know why they're asking for this data set. They know how they're going to use it, but OMB is checking on it because OMB technically owns Do Not Pay. And so it's really about giving Treasury the autonomy to run Do Not Pay, and they've got the people, the technology, the expertise to do so. OMB just needs to get out of the way. I don't even think OMB would disagree with this one, actually. I think this one is a real easy recommendation to implement, like, next week.
It's a great message to end on. Please join me